Subject 7 achieved full profile compliance across all 18 parameters. This is the first such instance in the program's history. Date: October 14th, 1969. Note: Subject 7 died at 9:14 on the same morning. Cause of death: cardiac arrest, age 31.
I found this in the program file. It is not the first document in the file. The file begins, as program files do, with founding documents and administrative authorizations and scientific mandates. But it is the first document I read when I opened the folder, because it was paperclipped to the front cover with a note in the margin that read, "In handwriting I later identified as belonging to the program's director." This is what we achieved. This is also what we achieved. The program was called Archetype. It ran for 10 years. It produced, by its own accounting, 7 successes. All 7 successes died the day they succeeded. I found the program through an administrative record survey I was conducting for an institutional inventory of Soviet psychological training programs. Archetype appeared as a cross-reference flag in the Psychiatric Research Database, a psychological optimization program classified at a level substantially above personnel management. The access clearance required a separate request. The request was granted. The folder was waiting, with the paper-clipped note on its front cover, as though whoever filed it last wanted to make certain that whoever opened it next understood, before reading anything else, what the program had found. Nothing personal. A classification level inconsistent with its stated category, and a paper-clipped note from a program director who wanted something documented at the front. The Archetype program was established in October 1961 under the administrative authority of a personnel development division and a scientific oversight body, whose affiliation the founding documents describe only by a numbering designation. Its stated objective was the development and validation of a psychological optimization framework for the production of maximally effective state personnel, individuals whose loyalty, responsiveness to institutional direction, and capacity for self-subordination to state objectives would meet the highest possible standard. The framing was administrative, and the justification was institutional. The Soviet state apparatus had a persistent problem with personnel whose private interests, ambitions, and attachments created friction with institutional objectives. The program was designed to solve the problem. In those days, the state wanted to know everything about its people. Every thought, every loyalty, every weakness. There was no privacy, no place to hide. Today, you have a choice. NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic and keeps your identity hidden from anyone trying to track what you do online. Check the link in the pinned comment for an exclusive deal on NordVPN. The profile was developed over the program's first year. 18 parameters, each scored on a scale of 0 to 100, with the target score for program completion set at 95 across all 18. The parameters covered loyalty to institutional hierarchy, responsiveness to direction from above, capacity to subordinate personal judgment to institutional judgment, resistance to external influence, emotional self-regulation, suppression of personal ambition, reduction of personal attachment, and 10 additional dimensions that the profile document describes in the clinical language of psychological optimization, without naming what, cumulatively, they add up to. I will name it. The 18 parameters taken together describe the progressive elimination of self. Not the elimination of personality. The subjects retained personality, remained identifiable as individuals, continued to function as people. the elimination of the specific set of psychological functions that allow a person to want things for themselves, to refuse things they are told to do, to place their own survival above institutional demands. The profile was a map of everything that makes a person difficult to direct. The optimization was the removal of those things, one by one, to 95% completion. The program director was Dr. Anatoly Voronsky, 53 years old, a psychologist from the Institute of General and Pedagogical Psychology in Moscow. He had spent his career studying the formation of personality and the mechanisms of psychological influence. He was the right person to design a system for psychological optimization. He was, as his working notes and the testimony of his colleagues in the file make clear, a man who understood precisely what the 18 parameters meant and who proceeded anyway because the institutional mandate was clear and because, in 1961, he believed the problem could be solved. The first subjects entered the program in early 1962. They were recruits selected from the pool of young state and party personnel, individuals who had already demonstrated above-average performance on preliminary assessments of institutional loyalty, but who had not yet achieved the consistency and depth the profile required. They were told they were participating in an advanced personnel development program. They were not told what the development was intended to produce. The psychologist who worked most closely with the subjects in the program's early years was Dr. Irina Belotsarkovskaya, 37 years old, from the Institute of Psychology. She maintained individual case files on each subject across their time in the program, conducting regular assessments and documenting progress toward the profile. Her case notes are the most important documents in the archive because they are the record of a clinician watching, in granular detail, what the optimization actually did to the people it was applied to. Her notes on Subject 3, a 24-year-old recruit who entered the program in the spring of 1963, document the progress and its consequences with the precision of a researcher who is recording what she sees and beginning to understand what she is looking at.
Subject 3 has made substantial progress across the primary parameters in the first 8 months. Loyalty index now measuring at 81, up from 54 at intake. Responsiveness to direction improved significantly. He no longer questions assignments before accepting them. The suppression of personal ambition is proceeding well. He has ceased to make statements about his own career preferences or long-term objectives. I want to note, alongside these positive indicators, a set of secondary changes that I am beginning to track because I believe they are related to the optimization process, though the relationship is not yet clear to me. He has become significantly less ill in the past 4 months, not healthier in the ordinary sense, but less reactive to minor illness. His immune system appears suppressed rather than enhanced. He has lost 12 kilograms. He reports sleeping less, but feeling adequately rested. His heart rate at rest is lower than baseline in a way that would be unremarkable in an athlete, but is unusual in someone who has not changed his physical activity. I am documenting these secondary changes because I have begun to see the same pattern in 2 other subjects at comparable stages of optimization. I do not yet know whether these changes are a consequence of the psychological work or an incidental correlation. I am going to keep measuring.
She kept measuring. The secondary changes were not incidental. Her notes from 2 years later, February 1965, the month of the first death, contain an entry she wrote 3 days after Subject 3 died, an entry she returned to and annotated twice in subsequent months. Belotsarkovskaya wrote in her personal notes dated March 1965.
I have been trying to understand what I observed in Subject 3's final weeks, and I want to document it carefully because I believe the documentation is important, even though I do not yet understand what it means. In the 6 weeks before his death, his scores on the primary parameters continued to improve. His loyalty index reached 88, the highest in the program's history at that point. His responsiveness to direction was near perfect. The suppression of personal ambition was complete. He no longer expressed any preference about anything, not work assignments, not food, not the temperature of his room. He was, by every metric the program uses to measure progress, our most successful subject. He was also, in those same 6 weeks, progressively disappearing. Not his personality. He remained recognizable as himself. Something else. The quality I can only describe as his interest in continuing. Not suicidal ideation, nothing clinical in that direction, simply a diminishing investment in the maintenance of his own existence, as though the psychological work of subordinating his own preferences had extended, gradually and without deliberate intention, to the preference for being alive. I watched this happen, and I did not know how to name it, and I did not know how to stop it, and 3 days ago he died. I am writing this because I think the connection is real. I think the optimization did this. I think we are not building better people. I think we are dissolving them.
She added annotations to the file as the evidence accumulated. 6 months later, she wrote, "Confirmed. See Subject 4. 14 months later, this is the mechanism. See Tarasov's report." By the end of the program's 3rd year, Belotserkovskaya had documented the same pattern in 6 subjects at comparable stages of optimization. Progressive physical changes accompanying psychological progress, each change individually within the range of normal biological variation, collectively forming a consistent pattern. Immune suppression, reduced autonomic variability, declining hormonal regulation. The specific biological systems that maintain the body's independent functioning, the systems that operate without conscious direction, that persist regardless of what the mind is told to want, declining in proportion to the optimization of the psychological parameters that govern conscious direction. The body, it appeared, did not distinguish clearly between the psychological instruction to suppress personal wanting and the biological instruction to maintain the systems that sustain personal existence. Both ran on the same substrate. Optimizing one affected the other. The first subject died in February 1965. He was 26 years old. He had reached 88% compliance with the profile, closer than any prior subject. The cause of death was documented as cardiac arrest in a subject with no prior cardiac history. His physical examination from 3 months earlier had shown no cardiac abnormalities. The collapse was rapid, without warning, in a subject who had been functioning normally, who had, by the program's metrics, been functioning exceptionally. The program director called Moscow the following week. The telephone transcript from that call is in the file because Vronsky's lane was monitored as standard procedure.
I am calling to report the death of Subject 4 and to recommend a review of the program's methodology. We have lost 2 subjects in 8 months. Both deaths occurred in subjects who had reached the highest levels of profile compliance in the program's history. I believe there is a relationship between the compliance level and the deaths. I do not yet understand the mechanism, but the correlation is strong enough that I think we need to examine it before we continue. Subject 4. Did he achieve full profile compliance? 12 of 18 parameters at above 95. He had not reached the full threshold. He was closer than any prior subject at time of death. And Subject 3, the first death, 11 parameters above threshold. Also, the closest in the program at that time. I understand. I want to be certain I understand the implication of what you are describing. The subjects who have made the most progress toward the profile objective are the subjects who have died. That is correct. And the physical changes I have documented in subjects approaching the threshold are consistent with progressive systemic decline, not acute illness, progressive suppression of autonomous biological function. Continue the program. Increase the subject cohort. Document the relationship you have identified and report through the restricted channel. We need to understand the threshold better. I want to note my objection to continuing without a review. Your objection is noted. Continue.
Your objection is noted. Continue. 8 seconds of silence, and then increase the subject cohort. The program had produced a finding that its subjects died at the point of greatest success, and the institutional response was to continue and expand, to document the relationship between success and death, to understand the threshold better. Understanding the threshold better is what the program spent its remaining 6 years doing. Now I need to tell you what the neuroscientist found. I thought the Archetype program was a psychological program that had discovered, by accident, the limits of psychological optimization, that the human mind resists total compliance in ways that eventually manifest as physical breakdown. A finding of interest to psychology, tragic in its human cost, but ultimately a story about the limits of what behavioral conditioning can achieve in biological systems. I was wrong about what the program found. The program found something more specific and more disturbing than the limits of conditioning. It found the mechanism. It found precisely what it is in the biological substrate that makes total loyalty impossible to sustain. The neuroscientist brought in to characterize the mechanism was Dr. Grigory Tarasov, 48 years old, from the Institute of Brain Research in Leningrad. His mandate was to identify the neurological basis for the physical changes Bela-Tsarkovskaya had documented, to determine what was happening in the brain and nervous system of subjects approaching full profile compliance, and why those changes were incompatible with continued survival. His report, filed in 1970 after 2 years of investigation, is the most technically rigorous document in the file, and the one that arrives, by careful scientific steps, at a conclusion that his discipline had not previously needed to produce. Tarasov's report contained a statement that would define everything that followed. He wrote,
I want to state the central finding of my investigation before providing the supporting analysis. Because the finding is simple and the analysis is complex, and I believe the finding should be clearly stated even if it takes many pages to support. The finding is this. The psychological parameters that constitute the archetype profile are not independent of the biological systems that sustain life. They are expressions of those systems. Loyalty, in the neurological sense, involves the suppression of self-protective response. The biological system that causes an organism to resist harm to itself. Responsiveness to direction involves the suppression of autonomous goal formation. The biological system that causes an organism to generate its own objectives separate from external input. Reduction of personal attachment involves the suppression of social bonding circuitry. The biological system that connects an organism's well-being to the well-being of others, it has identified as significant. Each of these suppressions, pursued individually, produces a measurable effect on the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, and the cardiovascular regulatory system. pursued collectively to the degree required by the profile, they produce progressive systemic dysregulation. The body's maintenance of itself is not separable from the body's maintenance of its own will. The will to survive and the will to resist direction are the same biological function, expressed differently in different contexts. You cannot remove one without removing the other. Full profile compliance is the complete removal of this function. Full profile compliance is biologically indistinguishable from the state of an organism that has stopped maintaining itself. The subjects did not die because they were weakened by the optimization. They died because the optimization was complete.
They died because the optimization was complete. A neuroscientist stating, in the flat language of a scientific finding, that total loyalty and continued biological existence are incompatible, that the system which produces one is the system which produces the other, and removing it produces both outcomes simultaneously. Here's the first contradiction. The profile document, the founding specification for the Archetype program, developed in 1961 and approved at the highest administrative level, describes the 18 parameters as measures of psychological excellence. The language throughout is positive: high loyalty, strong responsiveness, deep commitment, consistent self-subordination. The profile is framed as a description of an ideal, the target toward which the program's optimization would guide its subjects. The program's medical records for subjects approaching full profile compliance describe progressive systemic decline, immune suppression, cardiovascular dysregulation, declining autonomic function, loss of metabolic stability. The closer a subject came to the psychological ideal, the more clearly the medical record described a body in the process of shutting down. The profile document and the medical records describe the same process from two ends. The profile describes what the process is intended to produce. The medical records describe what the process actually produces. The two descriptions are incompatible if you assume that psychological optimization and biological survival are independent variables. They are perfectly compatible if you accept Tarasov's finding, that they are the same variable, and that optimizing one to completion is optimizing the other to termination. Here's the second contradiction. The program maintained parallel documentation for each subject: a psychological assessment file, maintained by Belotzerkovskaya and her team, and a medical file, maintained by the program's clinical staff. For the majority of subjects at earlier stages of optimization, the two files describe a consistent picture: psychological progress, physical health within normal parameters, no alarming signs in either domain. For Subject 7, the final success, the subject who achieved full compliance across all 18 parameters before dying at 31, the two files are documents of the same event described from incompatible perspectives. The psychological assessment filed on October 13, 1969, the day before his death, reads,
Exceptional progress. Full threshold compliance anticipated within 24 hours. Remarkable outcome. Program objective achieved.
The medical file from the same day reads,
Progressive suppression of autonomic function. Cardiac rhythmicity declining. Recommend immediate clinical intervention.
The psychological assessment describes the program's greatest success. The medical file describes a man in the process of dying. Both files are accurate. Both files describe Subject 7 on October 13, 1969. They are incompatible only if you believe that psychological success and biological survival can be separated. The files demonstrate that they cannot. Here's the third contradiction: the document that should not exist. The Archetype program was formally concluded by administrative order dated May 3, 1971. The closing documentation cites the completion of the program's research objectives and the compilation of findings for institutional review. The language is standard. The program is over. In the same file, behind the closure order, is the minutes of a scientific advisory meeting held on June 17, 1971, 6 weeks after the program's official conclusion. The minutes record a discussion of the program's findings and their implications for personnel policy. The final paragraph of the minutes reads,
Given the findings regarding the incompatibility of full profile compliance with biological survival, the committee recommends a reformulation of the program objective. The objective of producing full profile compliance should be abandoned. The program has demonstrated that the full threshold is not survivable and that the optimization methodology applied to completion produces the terminal outcome in all confirmed cases. The objective of identifying individuals who naturally exhibit near-threshold compliance, sufficient for institutional purposes, insufficient to produce the observed terminal effects, should be pursued through systematic screening rather than active optimization. The desired psychological profile exists in the population. The program has established its parameters with precision. What is required is not the creation of the profile, but its identification in candidates who already approximate it. The committee recommends development of a screening protocol based on the 18-parameter profile for application to all candidates for positions above the relevant administrative threshold. The protocol should identify and select individuals who fall within the functional range, defined as compliance sufficient for reliable institutional utility, while excluding individuals who fall at or near the terminal threshold. The program's deaths were not failures of the methodology. They were the methodology producing its intended result in subjects who happened to be at the wrong end of the range. The screening protocol will find the right end.
The program concluded in May 1971. The committee met in June 1971 and recommended the application. The program concluded in May 1971. The committee met in June 1971 and recommended that the program's findings be applied in a different form. Not creating the profile in subjects, finding it in candidates who already had enough of it to be useful, but not so much that it would kill them. The administrative registry that led me to this file, the same registry I was systematizing for the personnel program inventory, contains, 43 pages later, a record of a personnel screening initiative established in February 1972. Different name, different administrative home. But the methodology section contains a direct reference to an 18-parameter psychological assessment framework developed from prior research, with a citation to a file number that corresponds to the Archetype program's restricted archive. The screening program has no listed closure date. The registry entry shows it as active. I looked up the administrative threshold, the level above which candidates are subject to the screening protocol. The threshold, as described in the 1972 registry entry, corresponds to mid-senior positions in the state administrative apparatus. Not the very top. The top positions have separate procedures. The positions just below the top, the permanent officials, the department heads, the institutional directors, the people who run the machinery of the state on a daily basis, regardless of who holds the political offices above them. Every person who has occupied one of those positions since 1972 was assessed against the 18 parameters. The program looked for people who had enough of the profile to be functionally loyal, enough to subordinate personal judgment to institutional direction, enough to suppress private ambition, enough to reduce personal attachment, but not so much that they would die from it. The optimum point, high enough to be controllable, not so high as to be dead. This is the system that has been selecting the people who administer the state since 1972. Not the political leaders, the administrators, the people who are there regardless of who is elected or appointed above them. The people who constitute the institutional continuity of the apparatus. I have been sitting with this finding for 2 weeks. The Archetype program spent 10 years and 7 lives establishing what happens at the full threshold. The screening program uses that knowledge to find people who are positioned just below it. In the zone, the program's data shows produces functional loyalty without terminal consequences. The zone, where a person is shaped enough to be reliably directed, but not so shaped that the biological maintenance systems have been compromised past recovery. The program identified this zone not by designing it, but by accident, by discovering through the deaths of 7 subjects that the threshold existed and where it was. Each death was a data point, 7 data points across 10 years, establishing the boundary between functional and fatal. The screening program uses the boundary. The screening program operates in the safe zone beneath it. The screening program has been operating there for over 50 years, selecting personnel for the permanent administrative apparatus. I have been sitting with this finding for 2 weeks. The Archetype program failed to produce subjects who survived full optimization. It succeeded in identifying the parameters that, at near threshold levels, make a person maximally useful to an institution. And it produced a screening protocol that has been applying those parameters to state personnel candidates for over 50 years. The program did not close. The program changed its method. It stopped trying to sculpt the mind it wanted and started finding the minds that were already shaped that way, shaped enough, shaped to the point where they could function for a lifetime in service of the institution without quite dying from it. I am going to close this file. I am going to note the cross-reference in the Psychiatric research database as reviewed and reconciled. I am going to file my access log and return the folder with its paper-clipped note to the archive. The note will remain on the front cover. This is what we achieved. This is also what we achieved. Vronsky wrote that. He understood both halves of what the program had produced. He paper-clipped it to the front because he wanted it to be the first thing the next reader saw, before reading anything else, before the scientific language and the administrative decisions and the medical records that explain how 7 people died achieving a goal that could not be survived. I have read the file. I understand both halves. I understand that somewhere in the administrative apparatus, in the permanent institutional structure that persists beneath the visible politics, the structure that administers and implements and endures, the 18 parameters are still in use, still identifying the people who are shaped right. Not too much, not so much that it kills them, just enough. Just enough is what the program settled for when it understood that complete was fatal. I am going to close the file.